nerds, what's up? It's time to talk about every difference between the novella and the show for Knight of the Seven Kingdoms episode 3, and to tell you what I thought about it. As a reminder, this is meant to be informational, not critical, so let's get into it. So this is the first time I get to say that the first half of this episode is mostly not in the novella at all. At least not scene for scene, so we don't get to see Egg practicing being a squire because we never see from Egg's perspective in the novella. It's completely from Dunk's perspective. They do have a breakfast, and this is the exact breakfast that they have in the novella, but it's in passing. We don't get to really hear their conversations. So all the elements of the conversations they have are very true to the book, but they aren't happening in these situations and word for word like this, or in these specific conversations, if that makes sense. For example, Dunk knows that the first people doing the tilts are the highborns and of renown. Egg doesn't have to tell him that, but that is information we do get in the novella. Things like that. So Sir Robin Riesling comes into the story later, and there isn't this kind of scene with Egg here. Also, this is, I feel like, the biggest change is that this conversation with the list guy doesn't happen about trying to get Dunk to fix a tilt. That is not a plot point at all in the novella. I think one of the biggest conversational pieces missing while they're watching the tilts is that Egg was giving Dunk a lot of advice and talking about all of the different knights and what their strengths were and weaknesses were and who they were. And kind of Dunk is like, wow, Egg really does know every knight in the kingdom, you know? This is pretty much exactly like it happens in the novel, except there isn't fighting. It's more that everyone just rushes on the field to help the person who's crushed under their horse and figure that out. Otherwise, it's practically word for word. Dunk doesn't talk about his dad like this because he was an orphan who never knew his dad. So that is just a slightly difference, but he did grow up in Flea Bottom. And now this is one I'm not 100% sure of, but I remember thinking when I reread the novella that Egg never lies to Dunk. He just kind of is very good at getting around things. And so I feel like adding this in and Egg saying, I don't know my dad, is kind of a little different because he's lying. There's no fortune teller in the book, so that doesn't happen. The Fossaway conversation is almost word for word. It's pretty similar. It was just slightly less intense when they're talking about if Arian did it on purpose or not. That moves on a little quicker. And in the novella, and in the show, they kind of linger on it a little longer. But I will say it mirrors more of what Dunk thought earlier. Dunk had these internal thoughts about wow, it kind of looked like he purposely did it, but he would never purposely do it. And so the Fossaway conversation is kind of more addressing that, but it doesn't happen in quite the same way, although it does happen, just a little less intense. And then the fight with Arian is literally almost dead on. The only difference is there's a quick line where Arian recognizes Dunk because he had asked Dunk to stable his horses, mistaking him for a stableman. The differences are so short, even though this one, the first 15 minutes were pretty much not in the novella at all. It keeps the spirit of the novella so much. It feels like there's not much to comment on it because even though it technically isn't in the novella, it's not like it's really changing anything. And I honestly think every episode's getting better than the last. To be clear, I loved this episode. I loved it. I think it ties episode 2. I really loved episode 2 as well, but I think they are both so good. I think this is a perfect example of how you stay true to a source material without having to be word for word all the time. All the Dunk and Egg interactions in this, they just bring me so much joy, first of all. I'm literally just smiling and laughing the whole time still. And even though they're not directly on, they're so true to the characters. And I feel like they really elevate that. In particular, the conversation they have in Baratheon's tent about that song and about was her name Alice and everything. I thought that conversation was so hilarious. And I think it perfectly shows Dunk is a thoughtful dude, but maybe he's not as cerebral as Egg is, and kind of showing how they think about things. And, Egg's all about legacy and how Dunk is more about the individual. I think there was just so much in that little conversation that isn't in the novella, but encompasses so much of what goes on in Dunk's head and how their relationship is, that I think it's just one of those perfect examples. I loved that scene so much. I also think they continue to do such a good job in the varied ways they bring out Dunk's thoughts. That's their biggest challenge, right? And I do think something is a little lost when you watch the show not being in Dunk's head and not viewing the world through Dunk's eyes. I think there is a lot of conversation there between the reader and the story because you know that the way Dunk sees things isn't necessarily exactly how they are. And that is an element of the storytelling that you just cannot translate into the screen. Like, that is why there are different storytelling elements for different things. But I think they are doing as good a job as they possibly can. Like, I think they are making up for it in the best ways. Like, that Fossaway conversation, I think, is a great example. By just making that a little longer and a little bit more intense, I think it helps the viewer understand Dunk's thoughts a little bit more. And I think in that moment was a perfect time to do it with Fossaway, because it also builds that relationship a little bit. And I thought it felt very natural. So I think they're just still doing a really good job of using his relationship to other people to bring out his inner thoughts in a way that still feels as true to the novel as they can be. So the cheating thing that they added, I have a few ideas of where they're going to go with that. I think it's a really interesting development that they're adding. It could be just as simple as they are doing an extra thing to build up how Dunk sees honor and what is honorable, and how honor is so important to him in being a knight. And I think building that up is a totally reasonable way to do that. And it'll obviously come into play later. If you haven't read it, I'm not going to spoil it, but that will be important later. The other thing I'm theorizing is that it will come into play as like another ally later. At some point later in the show, Dunk is going to need allies. And I wonder if they're setting that up there, or someone who can vouch for Dunk. Like, I think there's a lot of things they are potentially setting up there to come and play later. So I was intrigued by that change. And I feel like there's a lot of great places they could go with it. Again, I want to call out the actor for Arion, because I just think he's killing it. I think he's doing such a good job of just being that kind of calm crazed. I think that's an underrated skill. And I just loved, that scene is one of the biggest ones, right, in the novella. It's really a climax when Dunk goes in to protect the puppeteer. And he just does such a good job of just being like so calm about his anger, like that simmering, scary anger. One of my commenters in the last one of these I did said that he just has a very punchable face. And I'm like, that's exactly it. Like, they really just found someone that you can just dislike easily and instantly. And I just think he's doing a great job. What I'd be really interested to hear from those of you who have not read the novella and this is their first time hearing the story, how you felt about the pacing this episode. Because I think if I had to say if anything was weaker this episode than last episode, is that I think the pacing is just a little weird. Now, for someone who loves Dunk and Egg, that just didn't bother me at all. I could literally just watch a show of Dunk and Egg talking and I would be incredibly happy. But when I step back in terms of a show that is supposed to attract new people who maybe have only ever watched Song of Ice and Fire shows, have never read any of the books or any of the novellas or anything, how does pacing feel to them? It is the one thing, like, as fantasy lovers, people always want TV shows instead of movies. And I get why. Because with a TV show, ostensibly you just get so much more time. And we're greedy for time as fantasy lovers because we want everything on the page. But I think an often overlooked challenge of TV is that generally TV doesn't just have an arc over a season, it needs an arc in each individual episode. And I think that can be really hard. And even though I had really complicated feelings about Wheel of Time and the Wheel of Time showrunners, I had just very up and down feelings. One thing I remember, one of the Wheel of Time, either writers or showrunner, it might have been the showrunner who said it, that one of the challenges they faced was coming up with a specific arc for each episode. And I thought, yes, that is a challenge when you are adapting a book or a novella. That is an arc over a whole novel, and changing it for little pieces can be difficult. And I think episode 3 might have suffered a little bit from that, like having 6 episodes for this novella instead of just its natural arc over a movie. I hope I'm making sense there. I think that is a challenge, and I'd be really curious how people feel about that, who aren't super invested in the show. And if you're not, I don't know if you'd necessarily be on my YouTube video, but here we are. Like I said, that's like not a criticism I have personally, because I loved this episode. I'm just thinking overall. I think the only critique I actually had of this episode is I just wish we did get to see Egg talking a little bit more about all of the knights. I actually marked a few things in the novella to talk about. So it's like, Egg chattered all through their breakfast, talking of this man and that man and how they might fare. He was not japing me when he said he knew every good knight in the 7 kingdoms, Dunk thought ruefully. He found it humbling to listen so intently to the words of a scrawny orphan boy, but Egg's knowledge might serve him should he face one of these men in a tilt. And he keeps saying stuff like later in the tilts, and then there's one point when Dunk goes, Egg, who is the least dangerous of these challengers? Lord Gawain, the boy said at once, Valor's foe. Prince Valor, he corrected. Squire must keep a courteous tongue, boy. They did that a little bit. They've done that a little bit with Egg, but I thought like there was a couple moments where they could have just done that a little bit more. Now, in fairness, in the novel, that's mostly to serve the reveal that Egg is Aegon, it is Prince. However, I also think it serves to show a good balance between Dunk and Egg, and how Egg's knowledge can benefit Dunk and how Dunk's skills can benefit Egg. So I think there was a secondary purpose there that you miss out on a little bit. That's obviously like the tiniest criticism because it is what it is, but it's just it changes it just a little bit. I actually liked the drama of the reveal at the end. It was a little cheesy, but for me, it was like cheesy and campy in the right way. My husband, on the other hand, felt like it was a little too far. I will say, I think because it's so obvious who Egg is, you don't need to go so hard on that reveal. Obviously, I think it's supposed to be from Dunk's perspective, so I could see both sides. I kind of liked the campiness of it. It made me smile, it made me laugh, and that's what I like about the show. Overall, I thought it was another great episode. 3 for 3. I am super excited. I actually predicted when this episode started that we would end with this scene. I was pretty positive. I was like, I think there's 6 episodes. How do I still not know that? I kept thinking there was 8, and then someone said it was 6. I'm pretty positive it's 6. Whatever. I was like, the 3rd episode makes the most sense to me of like how that would be the ending. That would be a great climax to end on halfway through the show. And so I was pleased to see I was right about that. And I'm very excited how they're going to bring some of the new threads in together over the next few episodes. Yep, I loved it. Please let me know what you thought of this episode. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That's the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.